Today is Tuesday, October 22nd. We're having Colin Wilkerson with us to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. Welcome back, Larry.
Good to be with you. I just lost your picture for a second. I don't know.
Check it out.
I don't know why I did.
You may touch the, here is at the bottom. Do you
Oh, there it
see?
is.
Yeah.
I got it. I got it.
Okay.
It was my fault.
Okay, no problem at all.
As usual.
Let's get started, Larry, with the current phase of the conflict in the Middle East, considering what's going on between Hezbollah and Israel. It seems that Hezbollah is attacking the air bases, naval bases, and here is a video today. They put it out about how they're targeting and how they precisely targeting the naval bases in Israel. What do we know? What's your understanding of the current phase of the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah?
I think it's ratcheted up considerably from the axis of resistance, if you want to use that title, point of view, particularly Hezbollah. And I think what we're seeing is the results of, at least in part, a lot of their intelligence gathering, very, very careful, methodical intelligence gathering earlier when we were notified about drones here, drones there, whatever, satellite. I would suspect, I know for a case in point, that we were confronted with private satellite companies, Landsat, for example, who sell their products to anyone who wants the product and can't afford it. So you can actually now get pretty good satellite data if you know what you're doing and you know how to do it. So all this combined, one of my military colleagues said to me the other day, Larry, there is no privacy left in the world, including on the battlefield. I think he's right. You can be seen. And if you can be seen, you can be shot, you can be bombed. I think that's becoming a reality. And it's certainly a reality there. And Hezbollah used its capacity to very methodically and carefully plot Israel. And you just can't pick up an airbase and move it, or a port and move it, or a wharf and move it. So they've got all these target points now, and they're going to methodically hit them. And I think that's what they're doing. And I think Israel is in some jeopardy because of that.
And we've seen a drone attack on Netanyahu on his house. And it seems that, do you think that they were trying to assassinate him, or sending some sort of message to him that we know where are you located and we can hit you whenever?
Probably both. If they got him, great, they would say. And if they missed him, he would know they were there. And he would know that they could be there again and again and again. And the fact that he wasn't there at that particular residence, which I understand is sort of opulent in terms of where the average Israeli lives, it's very opulent. And so maybe they were trying to make a point about that too. I don't know. I think probably we're looking at a capability for Hezbollah to ratchet this up significantly and to continue to do so because they're being supplied. And I'm not even sure that it's just Iran anymore who's supplying them. I think there could be some other people, other states that are supplying them. It's increasingly looking to me like the Russians are setting up, for example, logistics lines that will allow them to support the entire axis of resistance, if need be, with a focus and a principal point of Iran. And of course, if it comes to Iran, Iran has channels into Syria and into Lebanon. So I think Israel is taking on now a lot more than it was taking on at the beginning of this.
Right now, do you think that Israel is thinking of the continuation of the conflict on the ground in the southern part of Lebanon, or they're just getting a little bit afraid of what's going on in the southern part of Lebanon?
I think they may be at a crunch point. And I don't know if you remember, but I kind of suggested this earlier. This crunch point comes when you've committed your reserves, which I understand they have. And you still aren't making any real progress, either in your tactical objective of killing as many Hezbollah as possible. And of course, the Israelis always want to bomb as much civilian infrastructure as possible, and taking territory sufficient to allow the buffer to become adequate for getting people to come home in the north. None of that has been accomplished. In fact, they've been stymied completely in both of those objectives, other than just killing innocent civilians, Lebanese in particular, and a few Hezbollah fighters. But they've lost some significant people themselves, including a brigade commander and several others of fairly high rank. I was watching a ceremony in Israel, just a little video of it, where the family was there, and this is not something Israel is used to watching, is high level commanders coming back in coffins. And what I'm hearing is there's absolutely no chance these people are going to move back into the north, and they've constituted yet another protest group against Netanyahu. You've probably seen some of the pictures of the protests in Tel Aviv, mostly because of the hostages, but in part too because the war's still going on and people are getting tired of it. And they're getting tired of their husbands and their daddies and uncles and brothers and such and sisters being on active duty, as it were. So there's a real problem for Netanyahu. He promised that this incursion into Lebanon would get the people back into their homes on the northern part of the border. They're not going back. And as a matter of fact, as I've said before, I think some of them, maybe quite a few of them, are going to get on planes and leave Israel in the rearview mirror forever.
Yeah, what's so disturbing right now about the Israeli attitude is that they're trying to attack right now again hospitals in Lebanon.
Yes.
If you remember Al Shifa Hospital in Gaza, they attacked, they bombed, destroyed the hospital. They said that there are tunnels underneath the hospital that Hamas is using them. Right now, they're saying the same rhetoric about the Al Hariri, if I'm not mistaken, the name of the hospital. They
Yeah.
want to destroy it.
That's the Israeli tactic. Whether it's just pure propagandistic lies or not, I'm not able to say because I'm not on the ground in the area. But I do have some sources that are telling me that probably half the time or better, they are lies. They throw them out there because, one, they want to cover up the fact that they just killed a bunch of civilians, so they throw it out there as the excuse why they did it. Or they made a mistake and the intelligence was wrong, or they just did it. And part of Israel's tactics is, I think we all know now, even Joe Biden knows this now, part of his tactics is fright and terror and scaring people. And the way you do that is kill men, women, and children, dogs, cats, everything in your front and your rear and your flanks and everything else. This is what they did back in 2011. This is what they've done all along when they want to, as they put it, mow the lawn, or even in more dramatic terms, restore deterrence. Because restoring deterrence to them in the region they're in, because they consider the life around them subhuman, restoring deterrence means slaughter. You slaughter them. That's the only way these slaves, these subhuman level human beings, that's the only thing they understand. You slaughter them. You mercilessly slaughter them, and then you go away and deterrence is reestablished. You come back later and mow the lawn again. That's their strategy. It's been their strategy for years. Some would argue it's been their strategy since 1948, at least the radical elements amongst them. And now that's what you got in charge.
It seems that the Biden administration is trying to do something in the Middle East. We had the US envoy, Hodgstein, to Lebanon. He was talking with political and military leaders. And we had Anthony Blinken talking with Netanyahu in Israel. Can we understand what they're trying to do right now?
What is Blinken? It's Blinken's 11th. Blinken gives the appearance of thinking like Madeleine Albright did, but on steroids. If I'm traveling, they can't touch me. I can do anything if I'm traveling. You know, being all over the world, never accomplishing anything. And Amos Hochstein is even worse than Blinken. I personally believe that Hochstein is a fifth columnist. I think he's working for Israel, much the way Dennis Ross did before when he screwed up the negotiations. I think we have a lot of people, not a lot of people, I won't say that. We have some key people in the United States government who have not dual loyalties. They have a single loyalty, and it's to Israel, but they're working in the United States. And Amos Hochstein strikes me as one of those people. From time to time, so does Anthony Blinken.
Yeah.
A mouthpiece for Bibi, one person called him, a friend of mine in the military, a mouthpiece for Bibi. And, you know, there's enough evidence of that to where I had to kind of shake my head and say, you got a point.
In your opinion, why have they decided to send Hochstein to Lebanon? Because we know he served in the IDF, and everybody knows that. And what would be the benefit of this type of activity, this type of mindset, sending him to Lebanon? And is that a message for the Netanyahu administration that whatever we're telling you about what's going on in Lebanon between us and Lebanese, we are honest in what we're talking about with you?
Well, you know, and this is a strange thing, not a strange thing. It's the inscrutable thing about Lebanon. I started monitoring it and for my unified command in 1981 and 82 in particular, and carried on through 1987. And you've got all these strains in the government. You know, you got a Christian strain, you got a Muslim strain, you got what I would call a Druze strain. You got all these different elements. And what the United States has always done is run in there and grab the one that agrees most with them. And we back that one. When we backed the Lebanese armed forces and when we trained the Lebanese armed forces, it was because those were the group, that was the group in power at the time. And then some other group comes in or a compromise happens or you have a coalition or whatever. Hezbollah came in, for example, as a political animal. And all of a sudden, you're not having any contacts anymore. You're not fruitfully engaged with Beirut. So you back away for a while. Well, I think what Hochstein is doing is going in and dealing with those elements that we can find that we like. And they're not in power, so to speak. No one really is in power in Beirut anymore. Not even Hezbollah anymore. It's governmentless right now. And so we're trying to find a strain that we can deal with and then come out and say, well, we negotiated this. It won't mean poppycock that we negotiated it because they aren't in charge. I'm not sure anyone really, governmentally speaking, is in charge in Beirut anymore, let alone Lebanon at large. So that's what he's doing. He's looking for something that he can come back and stamp, you know, we did this, diplomatic achievement. It won't be worth the paper it's written on. That's the way we do it, Neiman. That's the way we do diplomacy now. That's Blinken. That's Blinken's diplomacy. You name me one single thing that his 11 trips to the Middle East, Hochstein's trips, anyone's trips have done positive. Name me one thing. We don't have a ceasefire. We don't have a peace agreement. We don't have the hostages back. We don't have even a reasonable facsimile of a chance to stop Israel from attacking Iran, ultimately, maybe before the election. What have we accomplished, Nima?
And the chaos you're talking about in Lebanon is the outcome of the assassination of Nasrallah?
I think part of it, yeah, that's a big part of it because he, regardless of what we might think of him, and of course the Muslim world showed what they thought of him. I mean, he was a hero. But regardless of what we in the West might think of him, he was a calming hand on things in the face of a tremendous pogrom on the West Bank. I would call it a massive pogrom on the West Bank and genocide in Gaza. And he's watching this. And even though he has probably really no love for Hamas and its leadership and no real affection for what they were doing in Gaza or what they did on October the 7th, he nonetheless had to respond because of his position. He had to respond. And he responded very, very carefully, very methodically, very circumspectly, hitting only occasionally military targets. And look what Israel responded back. Now they're hitting everything that they can find under their bombs. And when they killed him, I was reading yesterday late, I was reading about the cost of killing Nasrallah. It was astronomical because of all those 2,000 pounds. But they don't care because they got the sugar daddy. They got the big sugar daddy. I mean, let's face it. Money is not an instrument of concern for them because they know the United States will make good anything they spend. Indeed, in most cases, it's a direct exchange. We give them the 2,000-pound bombs and they drop them.
Yeah. Yesterday, I talked with Colonel Jacques Beau. He mentioned that the British intelligence had all of the information about the Irish commanders, but they didn't assassinate them because they knew what they are and how they behave and what would be their reaction. Right now, it doesn't seem Israel has the same kind of strategy. They're killing each and every leader that they have.
Yes.
It took them a lot of effort to gather all the information about them. But they're
Peter Bergen
trying
had
to
a great piece on that. Yeah, he talked about what have they done? What have they really accomplished? And he just went through, and he didn't just do the current period. He went all the way back before Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, and he talked about all the people Israel has assassinated in Iran, wherever. Ding, 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 ding. What did any of that accomplish except ultimately make people in the area in particular, but I think in the international community too, began to think of Israel as an aberrant state, an abnormal state, a beastly, brutal state. And now look at what they've done with an assassination of Ismail Haniyeh at the inauguration of the new Iranian president, or on the evening thereof. And the man who was going to probably be instrumental to a ceasefire and a hostage exchange, that's probably the reason they killed him. And so many Nasrallah, what does it accomplish? You put some, as Peter Bergen says in his article, you put someone else in charge. And sometimes that someone else is more brutal and ruthless than the person you replaced. And that's the reality of it. It is not a strategy at all. It's barely a tactic. If it is a tactic, it's a very non and sometimes negative producing tactic.
maybe
And yet it's a forte. It's a forte of the IDF, of Israel in general, Mossad. We love to assassinate people. It shows how powerful we are and how great we are in terms of intelligence and everything. And then you ask the question, I'd love to get them down at a table somewhere and just put my fist on the table and say, shut up and listen for a minute. What have you accomplished? What have you accomplished? And I dare them to tell me what they've accomplished.
It seems that in those days, the British intelligence was interested in some sort of negotiations with Irish commanders because they wanted them to be at the negotiating table. Here comes the question. It seems that the Netanyahu administration and his party, and they're not interested in having any sort of communication, negotiations, talks with these people. That's why they're killing them, to kill any opportunity that leads to a negotiation.
If you want to look at it from their perspective, and when I say they, I mean Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu, ultimately, you're probably right that most of the time these assassinations do have an immediate objective, which is to thwart ceasefire talks, peace talks, hostage exchange, or whatever. Nasrallah, though, I can't see that. I can't see that at all, because what they did, I won't say they made Hezbollah fighting mad, but they made Hezbollah fighting mad. And they made a lot of people who otherwise might have stayed out of the fight decide to get into the fight, supporting Hezbollah. That's failed strategy. Completely failed strategy. And now I think Israel's going to pay big time for it. I think they are imperiled now much earlier than I thought they were going to be. I said they wouldn't be a Jewish state much longer. I still stick by that. But now I'm not so sure they'll even exist as a state much longer because they have got lots of power arrayed against them now. And worse, the power is growing and the power seems committed. So just listen to what Putin has been saying, listen to what some of the other leaders in the region have been saying, and you begin to understand that the bow wave is growing and coming at Israel. And the bow wave is growing and coming at us too, because everyone understands from the lowest Arab on the street in Cairo to the leader in Riyadh to the leaders across the Arab world, from Tunisia to you name it. They all understand that the United States is responsible. We're going to pay dearly for this over the next decade and a half or so. We're going to pay dearly.
And in your opinion, right now, the Netanyahu administration is counting on bringing the United States into the conflict, because because right now the way that they're behaving, they're trying to attack Iran right now. They're talking about they're going to attack Iran in the next 3 to 4 days. And do you have some sort of difficulty, Larry?
No, I was just trying to call something up because I knew the question you were going to ask me, and I had some data here.
Okay, go.
No problem.
And right now in Iran, they're talking about in the next 3 to 4 days, they're going to attack Iran. And they know that Iran would react as they were talking about. How can we understand the way that they're trying right now in the southern part of Lebanon? Their military is facing huge difficulties in the southern part of Lebanon. At the same time, they want to escalate the conflict with Iran. And we know that Iran is going to respond to Israel immediately, because there is no communication between Iran and the United States as we had before. No talks. What's going on in the mind of Netanyahu?
I thought you were going to ask me about the leaked intelligence about how Israel was going to attack.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it right after this.
Yeah. I've said before that one of the great mistakes in military history, going back 3,000 years of that history that we know most about, is to reinforce strategic failure. In other words, not to count your coup or whatever, count your chickens and stop, or go to the peace table or a ceasefire or whatever, but to reinforce your strategic failure. I think that's what's happening here, just as it's happening in Ukraine to a certain extent with NATO and with Washington and London. You reinforce your failure rather than, counting your losses and backing up and going to diplomacy, or the peace table, whatever you want to call it. I think that's what's happening here. But here's what Netanyahu's thinking as he does this. It matters no bit at all to Israel because the United States is behind me. And after all, even if I'm losing on all my fronts, and he is clearly losing against Hamas in Gaza, I think he's got the opprobrium of the international community even more generated now with regard to the pogroms he's conducted on the West Bank, and he's losing in Lebanon. So what do? You reinforce those failures. You reinforce them by bringing in your big sugar daddy, the United States, against Iran. So to get to that intelligence document leak and so forth, I have my own views on that. I'm not so sure that wasn't a straw man. I'm not so sure that we didn't do that on purpose. No one leaked it like a Dan Ellsberg or whatever. We did it on purpose in order to make people think that we are on top of things with regard to what Israel might do, and that they're not going to do anything unless we have given them permission to do it. And they're not going to do it in a way unless we've approved that way. And so and all of this is going to not preempt the election. That is to say, none of this is going to happen until the election is over and the results, at least somewhat firm, are in. That's a big question too, of course. So that's Netanyahu's ultimate strategy, I think, is I'm losing, but I'm going to win big, and I'm going to keep my coalition together and therefore protect my political position, not go to jail, because the United States is going to be so embroiled in this battle. I'm going to start with Iran that no one will remember that we started it in Gaza. I mean, I think that's really what he's thinking.
Do you think that the same type of mindset is avoiding the conflict between Iran and Israel, as we've seen before in that meeting between Joe Biden and Starmer, that Pentagon decided to interfere and just stop sending long-range missiles to Ukraine? Right now, the same type of mindset is putting these documents out because they don't want a big war in the Middle East.
Well, that might be some people's motivation. I think the motivation was just as I said it. I don't think it was leaked at all, except by government permission. And I think it got out there, much the way Cheney used to leak to the New York Times when we wanted the New York Times to convince the American people that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We leaked this out there to let the American people know that we're on top of things. Our intelligence is so good that we know precisely what Netanyahu is planning. And by the way, we are going to, because we know that, make sure he doesn't do it, and open parentheses, before the elections, close parentheses. Now, after that, it's anybody's guess what happens. I've been listening to Kirby and to the guy at the Pentagon, the Air Force general, I forget his name now, but he's pretty circumspect. He's a pretty good spokesman. And the idiot that speaks for state, and they don't even know what to say. They're just caught in their own trap. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to say about North Koreans being in Ukraine, if they are there either. I suspect strongly that that's a pig in a poke too, one that we generated. Just like right now, Nima, we're generating problems in Georgia, problems in a country that has its own problems, and thank you very much, doesn't need any other concern stirring it up. They're getting ready to settle their own situation. They've got international observers. They're getting ready to take care of the problem they have in terms of elections and such, as far as I can tell, democratically. And, we're in there stirring it up because we are afraid that that government is going to be more inclined, regardless of who wins the election, to be in Moscow's orbit rather than ours. Oh, funny thing, Moscow's next door, 11 time zones. Good Lord, they've got a military that's demonstrating its prowess in Ukraine every day. They demonstrated their prowess in Georgia. Thank you very much. They could have taken the whole state of Georgia. They didn't. They just settled for a couple of oblasts in the northwest. Why are we doing this? Why are we trying to stir Georgia up so there'll be EU, NATO, and so forth, rather than affiliated with Russia? This is insanity, Neiman, but we're doing it. We're doing it. And the same thing goes for what we're trying to do in the Levant. We're trying to have our cake and eat it and bake a new one at the same time. It's incredible. And Netanyahu's got us running around like we're a bull in the china shop, and he's got the ring in our nose and he holds the rope. And that's what he's doing, because I think ultimately he wants to attack Iran, and he's going to attack Iran, and he's going to say, I'm in extremist now, and we're going to come in and back him. And then we're going to be off to the races. Disaster. In that regard, here's what I was looking for. This is something I stumbled on because of a Norwegian friend. This is Alan Hart. I don't know if you ever heard of Alan. He died a couple of years ago, but he probably wrote some of the most seminal history of Zionism. And Alan had a relationship with Golda Meir when she was prime minister of Israel that was a significant and friendly relationship. He would send her a dozen or 3 dozen red roses, and she loved red roses. And she gave him, after that, a friendship was established, and she gave him always the first. He was working for the BBC at the time, and she gave him the first interview whenever things heated up in Israel. Well, this was 1972, and things were heating up. We were looking at the Yom Kippur War, and so he sent her 3 dozen red roses. And this is what he records in WordPress on 20 April 2016 in an article called Palestine and Zionism, the Whole Truth. And this is what he says, quote, "Even if the day comes," he writes, "when the governments of the major powers are prepared to confront Zionism, it could not be taken for granted that Israel's leaders would say, okay, we'll do what you want. My reason for saying this," he continues in the article, "is a statement from Prime Minister Golda Meir made to me in one of my interviews with her for the BBC program Panorama in 1972. At a point, I said to her, 'Prime Minister, I want to be sure I understand what you have just said to me. You did mean that in a doomsday situation, Israel would be prepared to take the region and the world down with it, right?' Without a pause for reflection, Golda replied, 'Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.'" Hart concluded the article. That interview was broadcast on BBC at 8 o'clock on a Monday evening. An hour later, the Times of London, then a seriously good newspaper, he had to get that in, changed its lead editorial to quote what Golda had said to me. It then added its own editorial opinion, quote, "We had better believe her," end of quote. That's what we're dealing with now. That is what we're dealing with, and it's dangerous. It's extremely dangerous.
Did you read the new book about the fall of Israel written by
Yes.
Dan Steinbach?
As a matter of fact, he called me up and asked me to review it.
Yeah.
I gave him a blurb for it.
Yeah, I saw this. Tomorrow I'm going to talk with him at 7 a.m.
Good, good. It's
Yeah.
an excellent history, an excellent history.
Yeah. And Larry, when you think of Israel right now and the way that they're trying to picture the situation in Gaza, do you think, do they have any, right now they're talking about, because they're talking about sending their people to the northern part of Gaza. It's something new, it's something big.
Yep.
And they're just putting out that they want to send their people to the northern part of Gaza. Is that possible in your opinion?
They want to get those people back in their homes. They want to get them back in their homes. I think that is becoming as big a problem as are the demonstrations in Tel Aviv with regard to the hostages and basically with regard to Bibi Netanyahu. If you parse it really closely, I was listening to some of the comments. I got a video good enough to actually have audio and hear some of the comments. They weren't just talking about the hostages. They wanted Bibi Netanyahu's hide. They wanted him run out of town on a rail. It was like some of the demonstrations earlier before the October 7th events occurred. Yeah, it's all they can do, though, because that's the only chance they do have of separating enough space, building a buffer zone that will allow those people to come back. And I would say, even if they started to come back, Hezbollah would contest it, even if there was a buffer zone there, because they're using rockets. And these people aren't going to come back if the rockets are hitting in their homes. So I think it's a futile attempt. I think they're just going to take more casualties, and they're going to take more casualties like the ones they've taken so far. This is a new thing for Israel to take these kinds of casualties in the way they are and the ranks they're taking them at.
And when you
know what Moshe Dayan said one time? I mean, this was a very derisive comment, no question about it. It was like some southern United States slave owner commenting about why he could beat the slaves, But Moshe Dayan, after the 6 Day War, was being hounded by reporters Some of them were Americans, some of them were Israelis, but they were asking him, how did he do it? How did he do it? Blitzkrieg war. They won in 6 days, and finally he turned on one reporter, he had that patch, and he looked at the reporter and he said, well, it helps to be fighting Arabs. That was the summary of it. We can beat the Arabs anytime we want to because they're a bunch of cowards. They're subhuman. And that's what he meant. That is precisely what he meant. They're finding out differently now.
Here is Netanyahu, Larry, defining what's terrorism in his mind.
Is target the innocent deliberately. And therefore my definition of terrorism is the systematic and deliberate attack, the murder, maiming, and menacing of innocents, of civilians, for political goals. You can tell a lot about terrorists, but what happens when they come to power? Those who fight for freedom and come to power do not impose terrorism. Those who do, who fight in terroristic means, end up as being masters of terrorist states.
He just signed his own death warrant. Prison sentence. What happened? What happened on the way to Aardvark? I mean, Dorothy wasn't escorting him. Either he metamorphosed into the devil incarnate, or he was lying then. In other words, he's a pure politician and he's going to do whatever the hell it takes to stay in power. And if it means killing civilians, that's what I'll do. And he has no conscience. He has no conscience. He has no guide. He has no ethical component to him. He's become a killing machine.
And what's so amazing about him that he feels so comfortable with doing all of this. And it doesn't seem that he considers any sort of concern when it comes to the actions of the Israeli government.
It's I can say this. I'll be 80 in 2 months. I can say this. I watched Douglas MacArthur on the Korean Peninsula. Actually, he was in Japan. He only visited the peninsula a couple of times. He was Supreme Allied Commander in Tokyo, But I watched him and listened to him through history books and very accurate recordings of the people who were more or less his sycophants, like Willoughby. And you watch this transition take place from a general who, yes, is pretty astute strategically and otherwise, and does some things that are really outstanding in history, military feats, if you will. But you also see a general who goes over to the Anacostia River and the flats over there and is prepared to use machine guns and cannons on World War I veterans who are marching because they want their pay and they haven't gotten it. I mean, this is Douglas MacArthur, a young Douglas MacArthur. And then you listen to his counsel in the stages of the Korean War when it was turning violently against him after 300,000+ Chinese had intervened and the U.S. Army was in riot. Strategic failure of the First Order. You know what he's talking about? He's talking about lacing the North Korean portion of the peninsula with atomic bomb explosions. Boom, 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 all across, so that there'd be a radioactive belt through which the North Koreans would not dare come. Should he be declared insane? And should he have been fired by Harry Truman? You bet. Some people just go through these kinds of changes. I've got a feeling that Netanyahu was always possessed of this kernel of evil in him. He just seems to be he seems to be today evil incarnate. And there are leaders like that in the history of the world. There just are. Many of them in the early days when it was more permissible to be that way. And a few of them in modern times, like Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, and like Adolf Hitler. Bibi joins a sterling but limited in the 20th and 21st century cast of real villains. I wonder if he knows that. I wonder if he realizes that in the pantheon of people who are just despicable, he will be.
Saudi Arabia, we've learned that Saudi Arabia has proposed a joint naval drills with Iran in the Red Sea. And
Desperately trying to keep that strait open. I mean, they're going to get hurt big time if that strait gets closed. 8 million barrels a day.
Yeah. Right now, Larry, when it comes to the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, how do you evaluate it right now? And
I think both are searching for, I think both capitals, Riyadh and Tehran, and you have to be careful because when you say Riyadh, you know you're saying Mohammed bin Salman, but when you say Tehran, you're not quite sure who you're saying. I'm probably not saying the new president, except slightly. You're probably saying the Guardian Council, the Ayatollah, and IRGC leadership heavily. They're probably trying to figure out a way to make sure whatever Israel does can be dealt with, and can be dealt with in a way that does not disrupt both of their economies so badly that they really are hurting. I mean, Iran's already hurting from our sanctions. Saudi Arabia could be hurting too. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi leaders always are basing their 5-year plans, their 3-year plans, their grandiose plans, all on revenues, and their revenues are basically from their oil sales, their crude oil sales. So you disrupt that, like we did in the simulation exercise I was talking about. We took down Ras Tanura, the greatest at that time output port for Saudi oil in the whole country, and one of the greatest in the world, if not the greatest. I think it was the greatest output. That's the reason we selected it. When we took it down through a terrorist attack, they just obliterated it. $300 a barrel for a barrel of crude oil. No one would ship. No shippers would ship. No insurance companies would insure. And we had reps at the simulation from Lloyd's of London, from other insurance companies, from MARAD, the Maritime Division. We had people there who knew what they were talking about and made these decisions. Serious stuff when you do that. Even if you just do it for a couple of weeks, it's serious stuff.
Yeah. Recently, the new president of Iran was talking about the United States. Here is what he said. I'm quoting him, Larry. "We didn't build military bases on your border. We didn't sanction your country into isolation and economic devastation. We didn't starve your people of medicine. We didn't assassinate your military leaders and officials. You did it to us." Here is the difficulty that we're facing in terms of the relationship between the United States and Iran. I believe that in the future, for any sort of calculation that is in the mind of any of these countries, they have to consider some sort of relationship. And they have to learn how to put their differences aside, how to make compromise and maybe cooperation. Do you find it's getting difficult, in your opinion? Is it getting difficult if Donald Trump wins 2024 presidential election?
Yes. Let me stretch I'm going to call it a metaphor. It's really just a description of reality, but let me stretch it just a little bit and take your description and say what it boils down to is you have to live with your neighbor. You don't have to live with the giant on the other side of the ocean, but you are painfully aware of his existence because he's punishing you every day, day in and day out. And he started in 1953 and before, when he overthrew your democratically elected leader and put the Shah in. So this is a long-term relationship with that great Satan across the ocean. But you got to live with that little Satan in Riyadh. And you got to live with those lackeys in the UAE and Doha and other places like that. And they got to live with you. And when it boils down to the essence of things, that's more important than that big guy over there. And when they get seriously threatened, like, for example, closing the Strait of Hormuz, they're going to get together. And might not be a tacit alliance or even an implicit alliance, but it's going to be something that operates against the interest of the empire, and for their interest. It's like all politics are local, you know. Well, when it comes down to it, relations are local, and they're more important than those that are way over there. So your best bet, if you're a superpower like we are, an empire like we are, is to recognize that and don't mess with it. Don't force them to deal with you through their union, because that's what we're doing. And Nima, it's even worse than that. We're forcing much of the world to be in union against us. And Putin and Xi understand that and are doing everything they can to expedite and maximize it. That's extremely dangerous for us.
Yeah.
And we don't seem to recognize it at all.
Antony Blinken.
Yeah, right. Make 11 trips to Moscow. Oh, you haven't made a trip to Moscow in your entire time as Secretary of State? Oh, geez. Yeah.
But we had the Lloyd Austin visit to Kiev. What was the reason of this visit? We know that Lloyd Austin is much more reasonable than Antony Blinken.
Sometimes I think Lloyd is too reasonable. He seems to be just doing nothing but carrying Biden's water, and Biden's water of late has been significantly tainted. I don't know where he is now. I know he's probably as worried about what's coming in 2 weeks as he is anything in the Levant or in Ukraine, because that could be even the conversations, Neiman, that are going on amongst the leadership of the military right now, with some people taking General Milley's point of view really seriously. If you're familiar with some of the comments General Milley has made, I mean, basically called Trump a fascist in waiting, or a fascist, and others in the military who are trying to remain neutral, and then still others in the military who are very much MAGA. They are MAGA. They're Christian nationalists. They're MAGA. Make America Great Again, Trumpsters, that sort of thing. Austin has got a real problem if this is a razor thin election and we go into a major period of contention between November 5th and January 20th, maybe even longer. He's got a real problem. He's got to control the military, and he's the only civilian there that has that kind of capacity. So, because I don't see Biden really doing the kind of job that he should do as commander-in-chief / chief executive. So I see Austin's responsibilities looming in front of him right now and causing him to lose sleep at night.
Yeah, you were talking about the Biden administration and how clueless are they right now about the conflict in the Middle East and Ukraine. Today, if you look at the mainstream media, CNN, ABC, Time, all of them, the main title is why Putin is not isolated.
Yeah.
And it seems that they're shocked by this. Everybody
Nima, I'm on a webinar this morning. I have a deep interest in the Arctic region because of climate change, and I'm on a webinar that's being delivered. Actually, two. One was being delivered from the Wilson Center, and one was being delivered from Greenland, and featured the Danish ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Denmark, the head of the Arctic Council, and others. And I'm watching these two webinars, one right after the other. I didn't watch them at the same time. And I'm hearing remarks that are really disturbing. You know, they're just going on with the science, with the threat from the climate change and other things, the reduction of the ice. And then one of the U.S., an ambassador, political ambassador, but a very, very, very smart guy. He was a tremendously successful businessman before he became an ambassador for Biden. And he's now our ambassador to Denmark, I think. And he just has to get this aside out. You know, there's a new problem in the Arctic. And the problem is we only have about half of it we can deal with. Well, I knew what he meant. And he went on to explain what he meant. The Russians are in the other half. They're in more than the other half. They're in considerably, about 60%. And I'm thinking, well, Larry, 15 years ago at the Arctic Council, wherever you wanted to go, the Russians were a cooperative partner. And we were dealing with the Arctic the way we should deal with it. It's going to eat all of our lunches if we don't deal with it, you know? And now here we got this guy who is saying, we can only deal with 40, 50% of it because the Russians are in the rest. We can't talk to the Russians. We can't speak to the Russians. We can't have any dealings with the Russians at all. How utterly stupid. But that's who we are. That's who we are today.
Yeah. Here is, Larry, here is the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom addressing how we can put an end to the conflict in Ukraine.
Did you ask him when they're going to send a new ambassador
Ukraine,
here?
And the conflict will be resolved the day after tomorrow.
Is there any
Well, stop the flow of armaments to the Ukraine, and the conflict will be resolved the day after tomorrow.
Is there any chance that
To
Vladimir
stop the
Putin
armament supplies.
is there any chance that Vladimir Putin will budge? Because it may be that he will put such strain on his country that in the end it will be impossible for him to hold on.
Laura, it's a wrong assumption that there is a big strain economically on Russia. Russia lives with its own absolutely normal life. We are in favor of speediest political negotiated solution over there. But we do not feel reciprocity. No one, neither Ukrainian president nor his government, neither officially, none of the NATO government are speaking about negotiations.
I would say that his solution would work for the Middle East as well.
Yep. How about that? How about that? Out of our enemy's mouth comes the solution. Well, you know, if you were talking to Sergei Lavrov at a moment of innocence and mutual relations, like when Colin Powell would talk to him on the cell phone every day, yeah, Colin and Sergei would have worked this out in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. And Colin would have absolutely refused even the president's order not to talk to the minister in the Soviet Union. He would have said, if I can't talk to Sergei, I'm out of here, Mr. President. I'm gone because you've just cut my right arm off. I mean, yeah, that's just not the way you do business. It's just not the way you do business. It's more important to talk, especially when you're in a proxy conflict like this, where you're not really upfront and engaged. No blood is being shed of quantity of Americans, and Americans don't have a vested interest in it. You need to be talking. It's more important than shipping arms is talking. And we're not. Nima, I don't know what's happened to us. We have fallen into a class of people in both parties that have no sense of real governing processes, no sense of security, no sense of diplomacy, no sense of foreign policy, and every sense of politics, which is the most damaging thing you can do to diplomacy, foreign policy, and security policy. Let it be dictated by domestic interests. Even worse, not the domestic interests of the American people, but your political party's domestic interests. That's where we are. That's their calculus. That's how they judge everything. And they don't pay any attention of consequence to anything else. And they think our power is so great that they can get away with that. I'm sorry. Our power is not that great anymore. The residuals of our power are being eaten up every day, if nothing else, by our reputational degradation.
In this interview that the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom was talking with BBC, the journalist is pointing out that Russia is in a dire situation. And how do you see? Let me play it out for you, Larry. It's unbelievable.
The truth. that your country is suffering because of this conflict and there is no end in sight. And
Laura,
perhaps you here in London,
I
tucked
was in
away
my
safely
country,
in these grand surroundings, aren't in touch with what's going on at home.
I was several times in my country in the recent year. I didn't discover any kind of decline. It is absolutely prosperous. It is full of all other journalists that those who would like to visit my country, they're welcome to see it. So we have no decline. We have recovered our economy, if not this year, but last year already. It has gone up very quickly, and it continued to go up much quicker than the economies of the Big Seven or European Union. We are entered now big 10 industrialized country where we have taken your place, by the way, it's number 7. And UK is now out of this 10 most industrialized country.
Hand it to her. Hand it to her. We've taken your place. He's right. They have.
And what's so amazing that she's offering to him that you are disconnected with the reality.
Yeah, you're the lady who's disconnected from reality. You know, watching the media in the West, but particularly in my own country, is a real challenge. I told my daughter the other day, she sent me something from the New York Times, and I just said, I never read that rag. I never read that rag at all. But because you pointed it out to me, I will read it. So I read it. And I went back to her and I said, don't point anything out to me again. It's a rag. It's a rag. And the Washington Post is a rag. And the Atlantic is a rag. And you wonder what's happened to us. Well, I know what's happened to us. We had this decision some years ago that John McCain participated in, bless his heart, where we sold our media to about 5 billionaires. And those billionaires own our media, and they've changed since. Like, for example, I think the Washington Post now is owned by Amazon, by Jeff Bezos. But it doesn't matter. Oligarchs all have basically the same fundamental interests. And it is not the American people. It is not the state of America. It's their moneyed interest. And so you got bought and paid for mouthpieces for whomever is the current set of oligarchs or people that are in front of them in the government. That's the reality of it. We have no more media in this country other than alternative media. And that's very discordant, confused, complex to get into and try to sort the chaff from the wheat. Finding a show like yours where there's decent conversation is opposed by 14 shows that are just sick. The lies that are on the internet are incredible too. So I don't know how the American people do anything other than persevere because they have no outlets. And Jefferson's old admonition that if you let the truth out in the public square and you let it combat all the evil and the lies and everything, the truth will ultimately win. Well, he was also the person who hated newspapers because they did so much damage to him. But he's also the person who said, if I had to choose between newspapers and government, I would choose newspapers. I don't think he'd say that today because there aren't any newspapers of note. That's the reason when I was quoting the piece from BBC, that's the reason he said at that time it was a good newspaper because it isn't anymore. London's as polluted as anyone else. And if you want a polluted city, Tel Aviv, because Sheldon Adelson bought almost every paper other than Haaretz, the oldest newspaper in Israel, and gave it to Netanyahu.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always talking.
Thank you for having me. Keep going and stay where you are. I don't see you in Rio.
See you later.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care.